Hello, and welcome to our first program of 2021. I'm Stephanie Gaspar, President of Kissimmeevalleyaudubonsociety, and appreciate everyone watching our program this evening. I hope everyone had a safe and healthy holiday, and our chapter is happy to start up with our monthly virtual programs again. Last month, we had Larry Rosen give us a tour of his birding trip to South Africa, and it was very interesting. Next month, we have Jason Fisher, the Disney Conservation Manager, joining us, and he will be speaking about Disney's avian conservation efforts. Stay up to date with our programs by following us on Facebook and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. This evening, I am very excited and pleased to present Lauren Puleo as our guest speaker. I met Lauren during my senior year at UCF in 2019. While I was in the process of forming the UCF Knighthawk chapter, she came on board and became one of the founding officers. Later that fall, she was accepted to the Audubon Florida's year-long CLI, which stands for the Conservation Leadership Initiative program, and I was paired with her as her mentor. After I graduated, she became the new UCF Nighthawk president and still remains in that position. Since then, I've remained in touch with her and I am very impressed by her research and interest in ornithology. Tonight, she will be speaking about how climate change affects migration patterns in gray catbirds. If you have any questions during the chat, type them into the chat box and we will answer them at the end of her presentation. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Lauren. I will now pass it over to her. All right.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Puleo, and thank you, Stephanie, for that awesome introduction. I'd like to thank Stephanie for asking me to host tonight's program, and also I'd like to thank Kissimmee Valley Audubon Society for hosting me tonight. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys a little bit about what I've been doing for my undergraduate research at the University of Central Florida. So Stephanie gave a great intro about me, but I wanted to start a little bit about myself. So I'm a senior undergraduate and I'm a biology major at the University of Central Florida. I will hopefully be graduating this spring. And at UCF, I am involved in various things. So the first thing, I am a research student in Dr. Anna Forsman's wild symbiosis lab at UCF. And through her lab, not only do I conduct my own undergraduate research, I'm also involved in various ornithological activities on campus, such as the Purple Martin Conservation Association collab, or the Purple Martin project at UCF. I think you guys had a talk about that recently. So I help with that. And then I'm also the president of the Knighthawk Audubon UCF campus chapter. So shortly after Stephanie departed and graduated from UCF, I filled her position, and since then I've been the president. Like she also said, I am an alumna of the Audubon's Conservation Leadership Initiative year-long program. And through that, Stephanie was also my mentor. So I'm going to start where it all started. And so this takes me back to my junior year. So my junior year at UCF, I found myself really stressed with school and I wanted to get involved in my community. In high school, I did lots of volunteer work and I've always grown up loving animals. And so I landed myself as a volunteer at the Audubon Center for Birds of Prey. So if you don't know the Audubon Center for Birds of Prey, I urge you to look it up. I urge you to go visit. It's an awesome place. You can find it here in Maitland, Florida. And it is a rehabilitation center for raptors. And not only do they release tons of raptors back into the wild every single year, they also provide an opportunity for you to go see non-releasable raptors at their facility and to learn more about the conservation of raptors in Florida. So although this was a great experience and I loved doing this volunteer position, I kind of found that raptors maybe weren't for me, but luckily all of the friendly folks there at the Audubon Center for Birds of Prey were able to steer me to my next stop on my journey, which was the Wekiva Basin Bird Banding Station. So I was a volunteer here for quite a bit of time, and the Wekiva Basin Bird Banding Stations here in Central Florida. It's located at Lake Lotus Park in Altamont Springs, Florida, and the master bander there is Andrew Boyle. So here, I woke up really early on Sunday mornings And I went out to the station with my friends and was able to really witness the spectacle of migration, the spectacle of plumage, and to really fall in love with migratory songbirds. And so what's citizen science? In case you don't know, I'm sure you are all very familiar through your whatever it is that you do, whether it's through Audubon, simply reporting birds on eBird, that's a form of citizen science. Whether you're donating your time as a citizen to help collect data in your local area, all of that data is aiding in scientific research. And it's an awesome thing to increase scientific knowledge. And so this relationship between citizen science and also research and research scientists is so critical and important. And so specifically when we're talking about bird banding, the data that's collected at bird banding stations is given off to the USGS bird banding laboratory, and they're able to make an electronic file out of this data and house this giant publicly available data set that's been being collected. This data's been collected for years and years all over North America. So the nitty gritty of bird banding. And so I like to say that although the early bird gets the worm, the early bander gets the bird. So if you've ever done bird banding, you know that it's, you have to be a morning person, right? You have to wake up before the sunrise, you get to the site that you're going to be banding at, and you help to set up mist nets. So mist netting is the main form of assisting bird banding efforts. And so it consists of putting up these poles that have these very thin, almost hairnet-like nets, and then they form a pocket. And so once those nets are up at the crack of dawn, the sun comes up, the birds wake up, they start to fly, they want to find breakfast, and they fly into these nets. And the great thing about this, once they fly into these nets, they might find themselves landing in one of these pockets. And so then a trained volunteer or the master bander can go and safely collect the bird from the net. And then we're able to get morphological data on these birds. And then we're also able to tag these birds with a unique band that has an identification code on it, so that if it ever is encountered at the same station or another station, we know where that bird has been previously. And so what types of data can we collect and how does this work? So you might see this funny picture of bags hanging on a string, and it's an awesome thing to witness if you ever get out to a bird banding station. The best way to kind of house these birds while you're about to collect this data is once they get them out of the net, they put them into a cloth bag like this, and then they hang it up on the string, and the bander goes down the line. And so the first thing that they may do is they may weigh that bag that has the bird in it and the bag, and then they're able to just subtract the weight of the bag from the weight that they get with the bird in it and to record its weight. They may blow on its chest to be able to determine fat score, to look at those fat reserves from the migration process. They may, if it's a sexually dimorphic species, a very common bird that we all know is the cardinal. So we're easily able to tell, right, if that's a female or a male bird. Potentially, sometimes they're able to tell the age of the bird. And then for me, what's most exciting is the data that's recorded of the date and the time that that bird was banded. And so we do this, it's awesome. We get to witness the spectacle of migration. We get to see these birds. But in the end, this data is housed, what does it do? So this publicly available data that gets submitted from banding stations all across the North America is now available for scientists to use. Now, this data is going to be able to answer important biological questions. And if you're not familiar with a lot of the research going on in the ornithology world, it's important to know that so much of it is due to the efforts of citizen science. So I have some quick examples here of, realizing the full potential of citizen science monitoring programs. So much of what we know about migratory birds and about birds in North America wouldn't necessarily be possible without the efforts of citizens like you and I. And this brings me to now talk a little bit about my research. And so volunteering at the Wekiwa Basin Bird Banding Station One, I got to witness migration and see how interested I was in the topic. And secondly, I was able to realize the importance of citizen science data and see it firsthand getting collected, and this entire huge database of data that I really wanted to utilize. So for me, my specific interests lie in how climate change is going to affect migratory birds. And so that lends me straight into my project of the Gray Catbirds. But to give you a nice background and set the stage, I want to talk about what is migration. And for birders out there, it's as simple as going out in the spring, going out in the fall, taking these photos, getting our lifers, and really witnessing the spectacle of migration. But for the birds, on a very basic level, it's an annual cycle that occurs in synchrony with the seasons. So in the fall, birds migrate south because it starts getting really cold and the resources are really scarce up north. So they migrate south and they get lots of food and better temperatures. But in the spring, birds want to lay eggs. They want to have their hatchlings. They want to procreate. So we end up, the birds migrate north to the breeding grounds. But how does this work? How do birds know, migratory birds know how to migrate, right? And so migratory birds have internal timing mechanisms that are responsible for physiological changes like pre-migratory fattening, molting, and restlessness. And a lot of these changes are triggered by seasonal changes in photoperiod. And so a lot of you may be familiar with seasonal changes in photoperiod because in the winter, days get shorter, and then in the spring, days get longer. That daylight period is much longer. So longer daylight in the spring is so optimal to raise chicks, right? You need that extra time. But in the fall, we have shorter days. So, and really interesting thing that's been around for a long time, and one of the ways that we're able to see these physiological changes is through an emblem funnel. And so an emblem funnel is a device that's used to kind of show us the actual ability of birds to go into a period of restlessness when it's time to migrate. So what this contraption is, it has a funnel of paper, and then on the bottom, it has a pad of ink, and they place the bird into this emblem funnel. And then at nighttime, the birds actually, their melatonin levels decrease when it's time to migrate. And so they're pretty restless, and they'll start jumping up onto the paper funnel, and these leave footprints on the paper. And so it might look something like this. And so I think this is super interesting because you're able to see, not only do they know that it's time to migrate and they're restless, depending on which migration they're about to enter into, whether that's fall or spring, they're going to be jumping in a specific direction. And so this actual phenomena of nocturnal migratory restlessness is called Zugenru. So now we know how birds know that it's time to migrate, but how do they know when to get to their breeding grounds or their wintering grounds? And so this lends us into migratory phenology. So phenology can be defined simply as the timing of a biological event. And in our case, we're talking about the timing of migration. So it's really important for birds to pay attention to the time that they're getting to their wintering grounds and their breeding grounds, because they want to get there at the most optimal time. They want to have optimal resources. They want to have optimal resource availability. And especially on their spring breeding grounds, they want to make sure they have quality to mate. They have access to quality mates, and they have access to resources to feed their chicks. So spring migration is a spectacle in itself because this period of a bird's life is so energetically expensive. So spring migratory phenology is especially important because the hatching of nestlings must line up with burgeoning insect populations. So when insect emergence is occurring on the breeding grounds, because chicks are hungry, they need lots of protein. And for the adult birds, it's also a task to go out and forage and get the insects needed to feed their chicks. So over time, they've been able to make sure that by the time they get to their breeding grounds, by the time they lay their eggs, and by the time those eggs hatch, that hatching period lines up perfectly with when insects are emerging in their local area. So where does climate change come in all of this? And when we think about climate change, we think about a lot of the direct effects of climate change, whether that's changes in temperature, whether that's hurricanes, whether that's variable weather events. But for migratory birds, interestingly, and although many of those things will affect and influence migratory birds, what we think about when they were talking about something that's really important for migratory birds and how climate change will affect that factor, we're thinking about their resources. So specifically, in the research today, we're already seeing plenty of documentation that plants and insects, the phenology of plants and insects that migratory birds rely on, are already advancing, especially in the spring phenophase. And so in turn, this is going to influence the migration and reproduction of birds over time. But what's the issue? So why can't birds adjust, right? We wish they could adjust very quickly, right? But what we were talking about earlier was photoperiod. So photoperiod, that changes in day length, is not affected by climate change. And while this has helped them in the past, it now potentially is a disadvantage for migratory birds when they have this unchanging factor that is allowing them to migrate at the right time. But now their resources, the phenology of their resources have changed. How will they know to adjust and keep up with the availability of their resources? And they might not be able to, and that's the answer. And for a lot of researchers, that's the answer we're trying to figure out is how will birds be able to adjust, how fast, and will they ever be able to make those nice two curves we saw of resource availability and then of hatching line up again. And so this is a perfect example, a perfect scheme here to talk about that. And this is what we call in a broad term, the mismatch hypothesis. So migratory birds that are not going to adjust their spring phenology in accordance with that of their resources are going to likely experience a trophic level mismatch on the breeding grounds between the peak food abundance, which is those insects that are emerging right at the right time for when their eggs are hatching. But if that's not happening, if those insects are emerging much quicker, if migratory birds aren't altering their spring phenology in accordance with that, we're going to end up with an asynchronization. And although that's all very important, we also have to take into account many other factors that come with migratory birds. So not only is there diversity of birds, there's diversity of migratory strategy. And so we talked about this ability to kind of be flexible in the sense that will birds be able to keep up with the shifting resource phenology or will they not? And so that might come down to what migratory strategy is the bird utilizing. And so this is a topic that I've gotten really interested in, and we'll talk a little bit more how that relates to my study species, the Gray Catbird. But to explain this, we can think about short distance migrants that are migrating a shorter distance. And so if you're migrating a shorter distance, although you're still relying on photoperiod, a short distance migrant might be much more in tune to cues and changes in local environment and temperature, because the proximity of their destination for their breeding grounds is much closer. So they may, in a sense, be able to be more flexible to then alter their phenology to keep up with resource availability and that peak insect emergence on their breeding grounds. But long distance migrants, they're so far away, right? They have to migrate such a long way that they're probably most likely only relying on photoperiod as a cue to make them initiate migratory behavior. And so where that's going to be a problem is that potentially long distance migrants will have decreased flexibility and this being able to alter their spring phenology in accordance with their resources. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about my study species here, the Gray Catbird. And so the Gray Catbird is a Nearctic neotropical migrant, and it's only fitting that the first bird I got to help release at the Wakaiba Basin bird banding station was actually a Gray Catbird, as you can see in this photo below. But although you probably have heard them in your backyard, you have heard them with that cat-like mew, not a cat, might be a catbird, and you see them eating lots of beauty berries and that sort of thing. What a lot of people may not know is that they have an extremely interesting migratory strategy amongst their species. So gray catbirds, although it's one singular species, they have a very large distribution, and currently they're not really a species of conservation concern when it comes to climate change because their population numbers are so stable. But something to think about, and that's may potentially be extremely important down the line when we're talking about climate change affecting migratory birds, is that they've been shown to have a differential migratory strategy. So this interspecific variation in migratory strategy ends up causing birds that breed in the northeastern region of the United States to winter primarily in Florida, as you can see on this map. But birds that breed a little bit more towards the Midwest of North America primarily overwinter in Central America. And those Midwestern birds are then migrating a little bit of a longer distance. So when I wanted to come up with this project, this idea was really prominent in my mind. And so with the help of my advisor, Dr. Forsman, and a collaborator and another faculty member at UCF who has helped advise me, Dr. Robert Vitak, we hypothesized that climate change will have differential effects on the phenologies of short distance and long distance migrants. And we predicted that the short distant migrant populations of gray catbirds will exhibit faster rates of advancement in migratory timing when compared to their long distant migrant population counterparts. And so now we'll get into the nitty gritty of the methods a little bit, and I'm going to walk you through how we did this. So not only was I privy to catbirds because I had helped release them at the Wekiva Basin Bird Banding Station, but I also had great access to a good sample size for the station that I was getting this data from. So I was able to utilize the data that was being collected right here in Central Florida that I got to see being collected, which is really awesome. And I wanted to use that and then also bring in a comparison data set. And so through that, I was able to contact the USGS Bird Banding Laboratory and access data from that other flyway to potentially look at a site that would be presumably catching long-distant migrant gray catbirds. And so that first site was being the Wekiva Basin Bird Banding Station, and the second site ended up being data that was collected from Sugar Lakes, Ohio. And so to do this, we separated the data was both sets of data were collected from 2009 to 2018, and each data point was a bird that was banded, and it was the date that it was banded. So we separated this data into two time frames. The first time frame being data that was collected from 2009 to 2013, and the second time frame being data that was collected from 2014 to 2018. And from that, we were able to determine differences in peak migratory activity across those timeframes. And so to do this, I wanted to talk a little bit about a statistical approach I've been using in my undergrad, which is called circular statistics. And so circular stats is a growing field of statistics, and it was initially called directional statistics because it was used a lot to analyze navigational data. But a lot more recently, researchers were really realizing that this was a perfect way to analyze temporal data or annual data that's collected during an annual cycle, which for us would be the migration of migratory birds. Migration of migratory birds is an annual cycle, and it's nonlinear. And so this is the perfect opportunity to try to use out this novel statistical approach. And while traditionally in the bird world, in the ornithology world, linear statistics are still widely used, circular stats still growing, but the tests that are needed to determine phenological change are present and can be successfully applied. And it's already been utilized in various research publications looking at the phenology of plants and other animals as well, like bats. And so these are going to be some of my preliminary results that I'm going to share with you guys today. And I'm going to walk you through how to read this figure precisely. So this is the spring phenology data for the birds that were banded at the Wekiva Basin Bird Banding Station. So these are our Florida and presumably short distant migrant gray catbirds. So you'll be able to see that these black points are birds that were banded from 2009 to 2013. That would be in our first time frame. And then these red points will be birds that were banded from 2014 to 2018. And when you read this, you read it like an annual year on a circle. So up here being December 31st, and then we make our way through spring, summer, and fall. And so we then calculated the mean angle, which is represented by these arrows, and those arrows give us, we're able to determine an angle and convert that angle back into an actual date on the year. And so from this, we were able to see that spring peak migratory activity in the spring for catbirds in Florida actually got earlier over time. So we did the same thing for our fall data, and you're going to read this the exact same way, except although it seems like there's a small change there, any of our statistical analyses came back that this change was not actually significant over time. So now we did the same exact thing for our Ohio data set, and this is our presumably long distance migrant population. And so for this one, we can actually see there was a significant result that came back that they also were migrating earlier, but we'll talk a little bit about in a little bit how it's very interesting. The rate at which they're advancing is much slower than what we just saw for our Florida birds. We did the same thing for fall, and we actually saw for the Ohio birds that they were getting put to their fall wintering grounds, that peak migratory activity got a little bit later over time. And so in summary, what we just saw on those four figures was that peak spring migratory activity occurred around 14 days or 2 weeks earlier during the last 5 years. So those birds that were banded between 2014 and 2018, when compared to the preceding 5 years, which were birds that were banded from 2019 to 2018 for gray catbirds at the Florida site, which is our presumably short distance migrant population. And when we compare this to what we saw for Ohio, we saw that peak spring migratory activity occurred only around 1 day earlier during the last 5 years compared to the first 5 years for gray catbirds at the Ohio site, which is our presumably long distance migrant population. And overall for fall, while we saw no significant difference or change in catbirds in Florida, we did see that peak fall migratory activity occurred around 4 days later during the last 5 years when compared to the preceding 5 years for the Ohio site. And so what does this mean, and what do these preliminary results mean for me as an undergraduate research scientist? And so as predicted, the rate at which gray catbirds have shifted their peak spring migratory activity in Florida is greater than catbirds in Ohio. And this really highlights the importance of taking interspecific variation in migratory strategy into account when characterizing phenological change for migratory species. And so exactly like we talked about earlier, that distinct thing we might see with short distance migrants being much closer to their destination may give them a much better advantage at predicting what their environment's going to be like on their destination, and therefore they may be able to adjust much faster when compared to those long distance migrants that presumably maybe that Ohio population that only advanced their phenological timing by 1 day because they're so much farther away. But these differential effects of climate change on the migratory phenology among populations over time, what this may mean may induce dramatic species distributions changes and include geographic isolation of some populations. So potentially, if long distant migrant populations are unable to keep up, this could mean drastic population declines for them, while the short distance migrants, if they're able to adjust their phenology a little bit more adequately, they may have a better chance at surviving through climate change effects. And so what we talked about today, as far as migratory phenology and one species being the gray catbird, this is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to climate change effects on migratory birds. Many of you have maybe seen this report that came out in 2019, the Survival by Degrees, 389 bird species on the brink. I urge you to go to this link. I urge you to read about how climate change, how Audubon scientists have been working to test and see how climate change is going to affect the species ranges of birds in North America. And you can actually utilize their interactive site to see, as temperatures increase, how this will affect them. But I urge you to stay involved. I urge you to learn more about what climate change is going to do. And I hope what you learned today, a little bit about the small aspect that I've been kind of digging into here in Central Florida, how we can work together with citizen science, research scientists, and we can begin to better understand what we can do to better help migratory birds in the face of climate change. And so that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank Dr. Anna Forsman for being my advisor at UCF, Dr. Robert Fetak, who has helped me and assisted with all analyses of the circular statistics, the Wild Symbioses Lab, the Wekiva Basin Bird Banding Station, and the USGS Bird Banding Laboratory. At this point, I'll take any questions, and I've also left my email and my Twitter information if anyone wants to contact me after.
Hey, Lauren, great job. It was so fun hearing about the research that you're doing. So I do have some questions for you, and bear with me. I was writing them down during your presentation. Um, the first one would be, are you involved with any other citizen science projects? Like you had previously done the bird banding, but are you currently doing anything else?
So currently, I'm not involved in any other citizen science projects other than, I would say, the Purple Martin project at UCF in itself is at least a student science project, right? And I know that it's also expanding to be much larger and include other locals in this project. So that is kind of my next step in citizen science for me.
Excellent. The next question was, I had actually was thinking of asking you this, but then you answered it, and it was about what was the first bird that you encountered at the Wekiva banding station? And so was the catbird the first one that you released or the first one that you encountered?
Definitely the first one I released. Oh gosh, I don't think I could remember the first bird I encountered, but I think I might say something that sticks out in my head would be the Carolina wren. Not that I encountered it specifically, but that's where I really learned to memorize the call of the Carolina wren.
Okay. And how are you with different bird calls? Are you good at identifying by sound?
Identifying by sound is extremely complicated. And I definitely am nowhere near a lot of my friends who can tell the difference between the high-pitched chirps of warblers. But I'd like to say I'm still learning, and as I've gotten more involved in ornithological activities locally and on campus, I've been able to get a keen ear for some of the local birds.
Awesome. All right. Another question I have is, it is while banding birds, is it common to get bit by them? Like nipped?
Yeah, so that's a great question and a funny question because it really depends on the birds. So birds have different temperaments, just like dogs or cats. And there was a funny thing that would happen, especially when you'd catch a cardinal. A lot of times the volunteers would get a tiny stick off the ground, and while whoever was banding the bird, usually the master bander, was holding that cardinal, we would stick the tiny stick in between its beak to kind of prevent us from potentially getting nipped at by these birds over and over. They seem to be a little bit more aggressive than some of the others.
The cardinals, the
The
most.
cardinals, yes.
That was another question. Which is the most feisty one you've encountered? So that is interesting. Another question. Can you give a brief overview, if you're aware, of the diet of the adult and nestling catbirds? Do you know?
So I don't know specifically the nestling, especially because I think the catbirds that I encounter are wintering catbirds, right? Or migrating down to their wintering grounds. But I know that adults, at least here in Florida, they consume a lot of berries. So American beautyberry It's a great native plant, and it's also a natural mosquito repellent. And it's a great food source for especially gray catbirds. They like to feed on berry bushes. But for most birds in general, regardless of the species, they are usually fed insects. And that's primarily because they need that rich protein source in order to grow. So a lot of things like grubs and caterpillars and dragonflies and things of that nature are fed to nestling birds.
Excellent. Another question is, you kind of touched upon this briefly, but are you aware of, since you started your research till now, has there been a decline in the Western catbird population due to climate change, especially if you didn't really notice a change in their migration patterns? Do you think uh, possibly they can have more of a population decline?
Yeah, so a lot of research that I've and papers that I've read, and not specifically in catbirds, but long distance migrants are suffering greater population declines when compared to short distance migrants, and a lot of that is dependent on the fact that short distance migrants might be much better at counteracting these climate change effects by altering their phenology much faster. But long distance migrants that are stuck in this less flexible ability potentially are definitely showing more drastic declines. For gray catbirds specifically, I haven't had the access to do population counts, things like that, to actually test that. And since I've never been to Ohio and I've been able to access this data through the USGS and do it that way, I unfortunately can't necessarily get an accurate representation for the populations there. But definitely a great question and something that I anticipate happening for not only gray catbirds, but other migratory species that exhibit this interspecific variation in migratory strategy.
Great. Another one. You had that one image that you pulled up. It was a great image of the when the insects are emerging and
Yes.
time that the birds come. Do you know, is it because of climate change that insects are emerging sooner? For those who aren't aware of that, could you give a little overview of like what that's about with the insects?
Yeah, so definitely insects, their earlier emergence and advancement in spring phenophases is heavily influenced by climate change. And so there is a lot of research being done out there on the differential effects of like vertebrates versus invertebrates. But what we do know, and kind of if we think about evolution also, evolution can act much faster in invertebrate animals and in plants also, but much slower in vertebrate animals. So for catbirds or migratory birds in general, that rate at which they're going to advance their phenology is kind of similar. Insects and plants and things like that are going to be able to adapt and also adjust much faster to climate change effects than vertebrate animals like birds.
All right. Another question was, will you be, you said you're in your senior year, so are you planning to continue research with catbirds?
So I'm not planning to continue my research endeavors specifically with catbirds. I hope to have this project wrapped up by the time I graduate, but I will hopefully be continuing my research studies in graduate school in fall 2021.
Okay. And what is next for your career? So you're here at UCF and you had these plans, but looking forward, what are your goals for your career?
So my goals are really to stay on the track of investigating climate change. I think it's such an important topic, and birds are such a strong and important indicator of what's going on in our environment, that it's such an important thing to continue researching. I love looking at migratory timing and migratory phenology. So I plan to, wherever I end up or whatever study species I continue working on as a graduate student, I continue to carry along researching these themes that I've talked about today. And next for me, hopefully, will be a master's or PhD degree, and then following that, pursuing a career in academia.
Excellent. I'm very excited to see how your career will go and to follow you as you make your way through your ornithology interests. And that is actually all of the questions I have. I did want to add, I added the address for the Survival by Degrees. The link is in the description. And please, if anyone has any questions, you could email me or definitely contact Lauren, follow her on Twitter. And do you have any final words or advice for maybe someone that is interested in citizen science, how they could get started?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a great way to end the show. Citizen science really is at the heart of my project and is at the heart of a lot of research science going on in the ornithology realm. So if you want to get involved, lean on Audubon, lean on your local campus chapters, lean on your local chapters, Audubon chapters, and also do research. For me, it started by volunteering at the Audubon Center for Birds of Prey, and that was simply doing a quick Google search. And through there, I was introduced to so many other opportunities. Audubon itself does so many citizen science efforts. And if you want to do something a little less demanding, simply reporting your birds and your bird sightings on eBird in itself is aiding in scientific research. So please continue to do that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Lauren. Great talk. Thank you for everything. I appreciate it. And thank you to everyone watching our talk tonight. And we look forward to joining you next month. And have a good night and stay safe.